On March 15, 2023, the tectonic plates of the global economic order shifted. And yet, the silence was deafening. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other on Wall Street, where traders shouted over terminals and algorithms flashed buy and sell orders in microseconds. But 4,000 miles away, in the marble halls of a palace in Riyadh, a decision was made that will be studied by historians for the next century. On that day, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the nation that serves as the central pillar of the modern energy market and the bedrock of American financial hegemony, made a quiet announcement that rang louder than a cannon shot in the private chambers of central bankers around the world. They declared their willingness to accept the Chinese yuan for oil sales to the People's Republic of China. To the uninitiated, to the average American watching the evening news, this sounded like mundane trade bureaucracy, a simple adjustment in the ledger of international commerce. But to those who understand the invisible machinery that powers the global economy, this was not just a trade deal. This was a declaration of independence. This was the moment the monopoly of the petrodollar system, a geopolitical masterpiece established by Henry Kissinger and the House of Saud in 1974, was effectively broken. For 49 years, there has been an iron law in global finance: if you want to buy oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization, you must pay in United States dollars. This requirement created a synthetic, permanent demand for American currency that has allowed the United States to live beyond its means, fund massive deficits, and fight endless wars for half a century. But on that Tuesday in March, the monopoly ended. And here is the terrifying truth that political leaders refuse to admit: this was not an isolated incident. It was not a random anomaly. It was the latest and most critical milestone in a devastating, 8-stage collapse pattern, a historical cycle that has ruthlessly dismantled every single reserve currency that has ever existed. We are not merely witnessing a recession or a market correction. We are witnessing stage 6 of the life cycle of an empire. This is a cycle as old as global trade itself. It destroyed the Portuguese Empire in the 1600s. It bankrupted the Dutch Republic in the 1700s. It dismantled the British Empire in the 1900s. And now, with mathematical precision, it has come for the United States dollar. Most people believe that the dollar is invincible. They believe the greenback is a permanent fixture of reality, like gravity or the tides. They think that because the dollar has been king for their entire lives, it will remain king forever. They are wrong. Reserve currency status is not a divine right, it is a temporary privilege. It is a biological life cycle that typically lasts between 80 to 110 years. We are currently in year 80 of the dollar's reign, dating back to the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. The clock is ticking, and the sand in the hourglass is running low. Over the next half hour, we are going to peel back the layers of this crisis. We will walk through the anatomy of an imperial collapse, dissecting the exact pattern that brought down every superpower before us, and look at the specific mechanisms, the debt, the weaponization, and the loss of trust, that are accelerating this timeline. To understand the magnitude of what we are losing, we must first understand the magic of what we actually have. What does it mean to hold the global reserve currency? In the 1960s, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French finance minister, coined a term for America's unique position. He called it the exorbitant privilege. And it truly is a privilege that borders on alchemy. Imagine you have a printing press in your basement. You can print slips of green paper at a cost of practically zero, just the price of cotton, linen, and ink. Now, imagine your neighbors, the Japanese, the Germans, the Saudis, the Chinese, work 12 hours a day in factories and fields. They build cars, they drill for oil, they manufacture electronics, and they harvest wheat. They take these hard-earned goods, the fruits of their sweat, labor, and finite resources, and they ship them to your doorstep. In exchange, you simply hand them the green paper you printed in your basement. This is the reality of the American economy. We trade ink and paper for real-world resources. This phenomenon is called seigniorage, and it is the economic cheat code that has allowed the American middle class to enjoy a standard of living far higher than our actual economic productivity would justify. Because the world needs dollars to trade with each other, they hoard our currency. When Brazil sells coffee to France, they transact in dollars. When Japan buys oil from Qatar, They transact in dollars. This creates a permanent, structural demand for U.S. currency that never sleeps. This demand allows the U.S. government to do two things that no other nation can do. First, we can run massive, unending trade deficits without our currency collapsing. We can consume more than we produce, year after year, decade after decade. Second, and perhaps more importantly, we can export our inflation. When the Federal Reserve prints trillions of dollars, as they did during the pandemic, that money doesn't just circulate in Ohio or New York. It flows out into the global system to pay for imports. We get the stimulus checks and the new roads. The rest of the world gets the inflation. We get the party, they get the hangover. But this privilege relies on one fragile, intangible thing: trust. The world must trust that the dollar is neutral. They must trust that it is stable. And they must trust that their assets, stored in our banks, are safe. When that trust breaks, the cycle of collapse begins. And history shows us exactly how that happens, following the same 8 stages, time and time again. Let's travel back to the 15th century to see the first iteration of this cycle. Portugal was the master of the universe. They didn't just map the world, they owned the oceans. Through superior nautical technology, they unlocked the trade routes around Africa to India. From the spice markets of Goa to the ports of Macau, the Portuguese real was the currency of choice. If you wanted nutmeg, cloves, or pepper, commodities that were worth more than gold by weight in Europe, you had to deal in reals. This was stage 1. Dominance established. But soon came stage 2. Overextension. Portugal was a tiny nation with a small population. Yet they tried to police half the globe. The costs of maintaining forts, ships, and armies from Brazil to Japan drained the treasury. They began to borrow heavily. Then came stage 3. Competitors emerge. The Dutch and the English realized they didn't need to play by Portuguese rules. They could build their own ships and bypass the monopoly. By the time the cycle hit stage 7, Portugal was bankrupt, its manpower depleted, and its currency worthless outside its own borders. The real collapsed, and the world moved on without looking back. The torch passed to the Netherlands in the 1600s. The Dutch Golden Age was a miracle of finance and efficiency. They invented the modern stock market. The Dutch East India Company was the first multinational corporation, valued at a staggering $7.9 trillion in today's money, dwarfing Apple and Microsoft combined. The Bank of Amsterdam was the central vault of Europe, and the Dutch guilder was as good as gold. But success breeds hubris. The Dutch fell into stage 2. They fought costly wars with England and France to protect their trade routes. They spent more on defense than they made in profit. They began to rely on financial engineering rather than productive output. Then came stage 4, weaponization. During conflicts, trade routes were blocked, and trust eroded. Merchants began to look for safer harbors. When Napoleon invaded, the guilder's reign ended. It didn't disappear, but it became irrelevant. The world found a new master in London. The 19th century belonged to Britain. The pound sterling was the gold standard. London was the center of the financial universe. And the phrase, safe as the Bank of England, was a literal truth for merchants everywhere. By 1900, 60% of global trade was invoiced in pounds. But look at the timeline. By 1914, Britain had entered stage 2. The empire was overextended. The Boer War and the arms race of World War I shattered the treasury. Britain went from being the world's banker to the world's beggar, borrowing heavily from the United States to fight the Germans. In stage 4, Britain made a fatal error. They weaponized the financial system during the war, freezing assets and proving that London was not a neutral vault. By stage 6, the network flipped. The United States had more gold, more industry, and a stronger military. The final blow, stage 7, came later, with the Suez Crisis in 1956. When Britain tried to assert its old imperial power in Egypt, the United States threatened to crash the pound by selling off British bonds if they didn't back down. Britain withdrew. The empire was officially dead. The dollar was the new king. Now, we must place the United States dollar onto this exact same template. This is not speculation. This is checking boxes on a historical list. Stage 1 was the Bretton Woods era. From 1944 to 1970, The US owned 80% of the world's gold. We were the only industrial power left standing after World War II. The dollar was gold. Trust was absolute. Stage 2. Overextension. Ran from 1970 to 2000. This began with the Vietnam War and the guns and butter policy. We spent too much. Nixon was forced to close the gold window in 1971, ending the dollar's convertibility. But we saved the system with the Petrodollar deal in 1974. Replacing gold with oil, we maintained dominance. But the rot had started. We became a debtor nation in the 1980s. Stage 3. Competitors emerge. Occurred from 2000 to 2010. The euro was launched. China joined the WTO and began its meteoric rise. The global south began to accumulate gold. The cracks in the foundation were visible to those looking. But Wall Street was too busy securitizing subprime mortgages to care. Stage 4. Weaponization is the pivotal chapter. Running from 2010 to 2022, the United States began to use the SWIFT payment system not as a utility, but as a cudgel. We sanctioned Iran. We sanctioned Venezuela. We fined French banks billions for doing business with countries we didn't like. But the Rubicon was crossed in February 2022. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the US and its European allies froze $300 billion of Russian central bank assets. Regardless of your moral stance on the war, the financial message sent to the world was catastrophic. It signaled to every central bank in the global south, your sovereign reserves are not yours. They are ours, and we let you hold them on good behavior. For China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and India, this was a wake-up call. They realized that holding US treasuries wasn't a risk-free investment, it was a regime risk investment. If Washington could cancel Russia's savings overnight, they could cancel anyone's. Stage 5. Confidence cracks began immediately. In 2022 and 2023, global central banks bought gold at the fastest pace since 1967. They stopped buying US treasuries. They began repatriating their gold from vaults in London and New York back to their own capitals. They were preparing for the exit. And that leads us to stage 6, critical mass and the network flip. This is exactly where we are today. The network effect is the idea that everyone uses the dollar because everyone else uses it. But that effect works in reverse. 2. Once enough major players leave, the network collapses. We see the BRICS alliance expanding. They effectively control the majority of the world's energy, population, and food production. They are actively building a parallel payment system to bypass SWIFT. When Saudi Arabia sells oil for yuan, the network is flipping. When India buys oil for rupees, the network is flipping. The momentum has shifted away from the West. What comes next is stage 7, crisis acceleration. A crisis will occur that forces a panic out of the dollar. It could be a failed treasury auction where no foreigners show up to buy our debt. It could be a war over Taiwan. It could be a banking collapse triggered by commercial real estate. When this happens, the dollar will not just slide, it will plunge 30 to 50% in value rapidly. Inflation will not be 8 or 9%, it will be structural, persistent, and double-digit. Finally, stage 8 is replacement. A new system emerges. It will likely be a multipolar basket of currencies, possibly backed by a digital ledger of hard commodities, gold, oil, rare earths. The dollar will still exist, but it will be like the British pound today, a respectable regional currency, but no longer the master of the world. But why is this happening now? Why can't we just kick the can down the road for another 50 years like we always have? There are 3 specific mechanisms that make this collapse imminent and irreversible. First is the debt spiral. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was roughly $900 billion. Today, it is $36 trillion. We are adding $1 trillion to the debt every 100 days. This is not sustainable. It is mathematically impossible to pay this back. We have reached a point called fiscal dominance. The interest payments on our debt are now higher than our entire defense budget. Soon, interest payments will be the single largest line item in the federal budget, costing more than Social Security or Medicare. The government has only 2 choices. Choice A: default on the debt, which destroys the global financial system immediately and causes a Great Depression. Choice B. Print the money to pay the debt. This is what politicians always choose. They will print. They will engage in yield curve control. And they will print until the currency is confetti. This ensures high inflation is here to stay. The second mechanism is the deindustrialization of America. A reserve currency requires a strong underlying economy. But for 40 years, America has hollowed out its industrial base. We financialized everything. We make apps. China makes steel. We trade derivatives. Russia pumps gas. In a conflict, whether military or economic, you cannot fight with derivatives. You need steel, energy, and food. The nations challenging the dollar, the BRICS bloc, control the tangible resources of the planet. They have the hard assets. We have the paper assets. When push comes to shove, he who has the gold, or the oil, makes the rules. The world is realizing that you cannot eat a treasury bond, and you cannot heat your home with a stock certificate. The third mechanism is the velocity of information. In the 1920s, if you wanted to dump your British pounds, it took weeks to coordinate. Information moved slowly. Today, financial panic moves at the speed of light. In a digital world, a run on the bank, or a run on the dollar, can happen in hours. We saw with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank how quickly billions can move. Imagine that applied to the US Treasury market. The collapse, when it comes, will not be a slow, manageable decline. It will be a sudden, jagged line down. So, what does this actually look like for you? For your family? When economists talk about reserve currency collapse, it sounds abstract, a problem for billionaires and bankers. Let's make it concrete. The American standard of living is artificially subsidized by the dollar's strength. Everything you buy at Walmart, the cheap electronics, the clothes, the furniture, is cheap because the dollar is strong. If the dollar loses its reserve status, it loses its purchasing power. Imagine waking up in a world where a gallon of gas costs $15. Where a loaf of bread is $12. Where a new iPhone costs $4,000. This is not science fiction. This is what happens when a currency devalues. Imported goods become luxuries. Vacations abroad become impossible for the middle class. Your savings, that $50,000 you worked 10 years to save, might still be $50,000 on paper. But it will only buy what $20,000 buys today. You haven't lost money, you've lost wealth. The exorbitant privilege works in reverse. 2. When it ends, it becomes an exorbitant penalty. The inflation we exported to the world for 50 years will come rushing back home like a tsunami. This is the great leveling. The wealth transfer from the West to the East. From the consumers to the producers. From the paper holders to the asset holders. This brings us back to Saudi Arabia and the events of March 2023. Why did they make that deal? Because they can read the writing on the wall. They know the US keeps its interest rates high to fight inflation, which hurts the global economy. But they also know the US debt is unmanageable. They know the US weaponized the SWIFT system. They are hedging their bets. And they are not alone. Japan is dumping treasuries. China is dumping treasuries. Even our allies are quietly building lifeboats. In 2024, central banks bought more gold than at any point in history. Why? Because gold is the only asset that is not someone else's liability. It is the only money that cannot be frozen, printed, or sanctioned. The world is moving to a neutral reserve asset. They are tired of the dollar because they are tired of American control. And frankly, looking at our $36 trillion debt, they are terrified of American insolvency. We are living through the end of an era. This is not a partisan statement. It doesn't matter who is in the White House. The mathematics of debt and the cycles of history do not care about political parties. The Portuguese real is gone. The Dutch guilder is a museum piece. The British pound is a shadow of its former self. The US dollar is next in line. We are in stage 6. The alternatives are gaining critical mass. The network is flipping. The transition will be chaotic. It will be volatile. And for those who are unprepared, it will be financially fatal. But for those who understand the pattern, there is opportunity. The collapse of one system is the birth of another. Those who hold hard assets, gold, silver, land, productive businesses, will survive and thrive. Those who cling to the illusion of paper safety will be the fuel for the fire. The timeline is 10 to 15 years. The cycle is turning. The petrodollar is dead. The era of the dollar is ending. And the era of what comes next has already begun. History is not repeating itself. But it is rhyming. And right now, it is rhyming with the crash of 1920, the devaluation of 1971, and the fall of Rome all at once. The only question left to answer is, are you watching the signal? Or are you distracted by the noise? The world is changing, and it will not wait for you to catch up.